Hello, thank you so much for tuning in. In the previous episode, we covered the USPTO's AI guidance, and we touched on whether there is potential friction between the AI guidance and the PTO's most recent prior subject matter eligibility guidance issued in 2019. Specifically, it's been much talked about by practitioners that example 39 of the 2019 PEG is seemingly now less effective in overcoming one-on-one rejections following the issuance of the AI guidance, particularly in light of example 47 of the AI guidance, which dealt with training limitations, and example 39 was a training claim. So the title of this episode is called No Conflict. My favorite thing to say these days as someone who just started her own firm. I'm going to say there's no conflict between the examples and the two guidance overall, and why you should too. So this message is for practitioners, not lobbyists. So why no conflict? Simply put, if there is a conflict between these two sets of examples, then they can't coexist in the same universe at the same time. In that case, it will be the new one that applies and the former guidance is effectively overturned. And we don't want that because we like the old guidance better. Take a look at this excerpt from the new AI guidance. It says here, this guidance is meant to be consistent with existing USPTO guidance. However, if any earlier guidance is inconsistent with this guidance, then the USPTO personnel are to follow this guidance. So in the office's mind, there is no conflict. But if we, the people, are going to say that there is a conflict, they will then hold us to our own words and apply the new guidance exclusively. Notice how generic the statement is. They don't mention where a conflict could potentially arise. Just generally there isn't one, and if there is, it could be anywhere, then the new guidance applies. Here are the main takeaways of this episode. Number 1, argue distinctions, not conflicts. Distinguish between the new examples and the former examples. These examples are all fact-specific, so pay attention to the fact patterns of each instance and argue similarities and differences when appropriate. Which leads us to number 2, so that you can neutralize the unfavorable examples by making them fact-specific. In this episode, we are going to talk specifically about ways to make example 47 fact-specific. And number 3, because examples of the new AI guidance have much more facts and much longer analysis compared to the examples of the 2019 PEG, the examples of the new AI guidance are actually much more narrow in their scope and applicability. In effect, we can then argue broader relevance of the former examples. Particularly, we will talk about example 39 in this episode. Sometimes you hear practitioners say very generally that training is patent eligible under example 39, but not under example 47. That is a very broad statement. The training limitation of example 47 was not eligible based on its specific fact pattern, while the training steps of example 39 were eligible under a different fact pattern. Distinguishing based on fact patterns is very important because both the AI guidance and the 2019 guidance issue the same caveat, which is that all outcomes in the examples are based on their own corresponding fact patterns. Different fact patterns can produce different eligibility outcomes. So with these training claims and most other machine learning claims, it oftentimes comes down to whether there is a recitation of mathematical concept. There are 3 ways to recite a mathematical concept according to the 2019 PEG. By reciting mathematical relationships, formulas, or equations, or by reciting mathematical calculations. An example of reciting a mathematical relationship is when reciting a mathematical relationship between a reaction rate and temperature, which was the case in Diamond versus Deere. Reciting a mathematical formula or equation is just that. You've recited a numerical formula or equation, which is also what happened apparently in Diamond versus Deere, as well as in Bielski, which recited a mathematical formula for hedging. Here's an example of reciting a mathematical formula or equation. This is example 49 of the PEG. As you can see, there's just clear equation in the claim. By the way, reciting variables does not automatically lead to reciting a mathematical formula or equation. The variables do have to be part of a formula or equation. And the final way of reciting a mathematical concept is by reciting a mathematical calculation, which is the main category that we will be focusing on. A claim recites a mathematical calculation by reciting a mathematical operation or an act of calculating mathematical methods to determine a variable. This category is probably the most encompassing of the 3 mathematical concept categories based on the way it's defined, because it states here that the steps of determining a variable using mathematical methods, or performing a mathematical operation can all be considered reciting a mathematical calculation. A lot of computer activity, particularly machine learning activity, comes down to reciting a variable. So here's where example 47 comes in. Example 47 was deemed to have recited mathematical calculation in steps B and C under the AI guidance, and these steps recited training based on a backpropagation algorithm and a gradient descent algorithm. Now look at the explanation that came with it. When given the broadest reasonable interpretation in light of the background, the backpropagation algorithm and gradient descent algorithm are mathematical calculations. But the last part of this is really important. The fourth paragraph of the background supports the plain meaning by stating that the gradient descent begins by initializing the values of parameters and then applying a gradient descent calculation, which then uses mathematical calculations to iteratively adjust the values so they minimize a loss function. The background also states that backpropagation is a mathematical calculation for supervised learning of ANNs using gradient descent. So look at the background. Hello, mathematical calculation language. Like here, gradient descent begins by initializing the values of the parameters and then applying gradient descent calculation, which uses mathematical calculations. And then backpropagation is a mathematical process of calculating the derivatives and gradient. It's also a mathematical calculation for supervised learning of ANNs using gradient descent. So this is an example of how not to describe your invention. We practitioners need to know the fact pattern of these examples very well in order to distinguish between our own cases, and we can narrow the application of examples as needed. The hypothetical background here says that this is a mathematical calculation, like repeatedly. And then you do BRI in light of the specification, and that's the conclusion you arrive at. These algorithms are mathematical calculations. So big shock. This is why example 47 must be very, very narrowly interpreted and construed, because no practitioner in their right mind will say this stuff. So it shouldn't be broadly applied. In fact, we can go ahead and say that in our specification, hey, what I just described is not a mathematical calculation, and I'm not describing a mathematical relationship. Instead, we're describing something else. Remind the examiners to read in light of your specification and not apply these examples in wholesale. Now let's do example 39. First, I need to point out that example 39 is an actual method of training claim. Example 47 is a method of using an ANN with training steps. The step I've highlighted in example 39 is the step that I thought could be math given the background of this example, but they said there's no math here. This isn't one of those cases where there is recitation of judicial exception, but it's eligible based on practical application. Example 39 is a case in which the claim is eligible based on step 2A, prong 1. There's no judicial exception recited in this claim. Now look at the background. It says here that the expanded training set is developed by applying mathematical transformation functions on an acquired set of facial images. These transformations can include affine transformations, for example, rotating, shifting, or mirror, or filtering transformations, for example, smoothing or contrast reduction. And that's all in the claim. Not mathematical transformation per se, but what's described as being mathematical transformation. And here's the key point. This is not reciting a form of mathematical relationship, formula, equation, or calculation. And while some features of the claim is based on mathematical concepts, mathematical concept is still not recited in the claim. That's interesting. Remember the categories of reciting mathematical concept. When the USPTO is excluding mathematical concept and listing the exclusion categories, that is, formulas, relationships, calculations, they're actually not saying that mathematical concept as a category concept doesn't actually encompass math broadly, because math influences everything. It's physics, it's science. You can't exclude math in every shape and form from patent claims, unless you're the Arthrex panel. Sorry, that's not funny. I have to put that in there. Anyway, example 39 is a perfect example of permissibility in this category. That's why practitioners like it so much. It wasn't mathless. There was math in the claim, but it didn't recite mathematical concept in a way that renders it a judicial exception, because it did not fall under one of the categories of mathematical concept. And example 47 did not negate this principle. Example 47 was deemed to recite mathematical calculation because it said over and over again, this is a mathematical calculation. So don't do that. Oh, but when I really want to recite backpropagation, gradient descent in my claims, how do I get around example 47? So I'm just spitballing here, but first off, I wouldn't say algorithm. I'd give it a more generic term like method. Next, remember that backpropagation gradient descent algorithm were afforded plain meaning in accordance with their written description. You don't want to use algorithm then because backpropagation algorithm and gradient descent algorithm are known lexicon and will have a plain meaning which we won't like. By giving a more generic descriptor like method, you can then give it a special meaning that we want. That last step of the special meaning is the hard part, and I'm going to leave it up to you. Godspeed. Okay, well, I hope this was helpful. I know that we're still in a grind with these examples, but let's do our best to work with what we have. These are just some tools I'm sharing with you, and I'd love to hear your tools. Please comment whether you're watching on YouTube or IP Watchdog, and subscribe to IP Wednesdays by visiting llpatent.com. See you next time. Bye.